The vampire king had not visited the Hartwell estate in 40 years. The last time, Lord Hartwell's grandfather had still been alive, and the arrangement between the ancient bloodline and the vampire realm had been renewed with little ceremony. A simple exchange, protection from the creatures that prowled the western forests in return for modest tribute. Blood freely given, never taken by force. Grain from the autumn harvest. A barrel of wine from the family cellars. But this year, Lord Hartwell had failed to send the tribute. Not out of defiance, but out of desperation. The harvest had been poor. The cellars had flooded. And the family fortune, once vast, had dwindled to almost nothing through a decade of poor management and expensive taste. So when word arrived that the vampire king himself would come to the estate to discuss the lapsed arrangement, Lord Hartwell did what desperate men often do. He looked for something else to offer. He had 2 daughters. The whole household knew which one he intended to present. Elara Hartwell stood in the great hall wearing a gown of ivory silk, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, her skin powdered to porcelain perfection. She was 18 and beautiful in the way that paintings are beautiful, composed, refined, and meant to be admired from a distance. She had been prepared for this moment since dawn, her mother fussing over every detail, ensuring that when the vampire king arrived, he would see the finest offering the Hartwell family could provide. No one spoke of what would happen after he saw her. No one wanted to name it directly. But the unspoken understanding hung in the air like smoke. If the king wanted a companion, a servant, or something more, then Elara would go with him, and the family's debt would be considered paid. Elara herself seemed oddly calm about the arrangement. She had been told all her life that her beauty was her greatest asset, her only true purpose. If that beauty could save her family, then perhaps it was worth something after all. In the far corner of the hall, half hidden behind a pillar, stood another figure. Myra Hartwell was 23, 5 years older than her sister, and she had long ago accepted that she existed in Elara's shadow. Where Elara was golden, Myra was dark, her hair the color of a raven's wing, her eyes a gray that seemed to shift between silver and storm depending on the light. She favored clothing in deep purples and blacks, not out of any particular affinity for darkness, but because those were the colors that didn't show stains from the gardens she tended, the books she read by candlelight, the ink she used to write letters for the household servants who couldn't write themselves. The family called her peculiar. The village called her strange. The servants, who knew her better than anyone, simply called her kind. She had not been dressed for this occasion. No one had thought to include her. She wore a simple black dress with long sleeves, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she watched the preparations with a mixture of resignation and quiet grief. Not for herself. She had stopped expecting anything from her family long ago. But for Elara, who was being offered like a lamb at market, and for the household servants who had been dismissed 2 months ago because there was no money left to pay them, and for the whole crumbling estate that had once been beautiful and was now just tired. The bells at the gate rang once, twice, 3 times. The vampire king had arrived. He came without an escort. That was the first thing Myra noticed, and it surprised her enough that she stepped slightly forward from behind her pillar. The stories said the Vampire King traveled with a retinue of guards, advisors, and servants. The stories said he arrived in a carriage drawn by horses with eyes like flame. The stories said he was ancient and terrible, and that mortal eyes could not bear to look upon him for long. But the man who walked through the doors of Hartwell Hall looked almost ordinary. Almost. He was tall and slender, with dark hair streaked silver at the temples, and he moved with a kind of stillness that suggested he had long ago stopped needing to hurry. His clothes were simple but well made, a dark coat over a deep red waistcoat, boots that had seen years of wear. His face was neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor plain, but there was something in his expression that made Myra think of very old trees, the kind that had seen centuries pass and found them, on the whole, rather tiring. His eyes were pale amber, and when they swept across the room, they seemed to see everything at once. Lord Hartwell stepped forward with a bow that was too deep, too eager. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man who had practiced this speech a dozen times. "We are honored by your presence. I know the tribute has been delayed, but I hope to make amends. We have nothing but the deepest respect for the ancient pact between our families." The Vampire King inclined his head slightly. His gaze had paused on Alara, who stood in her ivory gown with her hands clasped before her, and then it moved on, continuing its survey of the room. "I am aware of your difficulties," the king said. His voice was quiet, but it carried easily through the hall. "I am also aware that you have dismissed your household staff without providing them severance or references, that you sold the village's grain reserve to pay for your daughter's gowns, and that you have borrowed against lands your tenants have farmed for 3 generations. Lord Hartwell's practiced smile faltered. "I came," the king continued, "because I wanted to see what kind of man fails to honor a debt his family has kept for 200 years, and yet finds money for silk and wine." Silence fell over the hall. Lady Hartwell had gone pale. Alara's composure cracked for just a moment, confusion flickering across her lovely face. And then Lord Hartwell did what desperate men often do when confronted with their own failings. He changed tactics. "Your Majesty," he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward Alara, "perhaps we might discuss a new arrangement. One that could benefit us both. My daughter is beautiful, is she not? She is accomplished, graceful, educated in all the arts befitting a lady of noble birth. Take the pretty one, and consider all debts forgiven." The words hung in the air like something foul. The Vampire King's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted. He looked at Alara, really looked at her, and Myra saw her sister flinch under that gaze, just slightly, though she held her ground. Then the king's eyes moved past her, past the pillar, and settled on Myra. She wanted to step back into shadow, to pretend she hadn't been watching, but something in those amber eyes held her in place. Not compulsion. She knew enough of the old stories to recognize that. Just attention. Pure, undivided attention, the kind she had not received from another person in years. "Who is that?" the king asked. Lord Hartwell barely glanced over his shoulder. My elder daughter, Myra. She is, or well, she is not suited for company, your majesty. She prefers books to ballrooms, shadows to sunlight. A peculiar creature, I'm afraid. She is standing right there, the king observed mildly. Perhaps she might speak for herself. Everyone in the room turned to look at Myra. She had never been looked at by so many people at once. Her instinct was to apologize, to make herself small, to defer to her father's wishes as she always had. But something about the king's quiet patience made her pause. He was waiting for her. Not demanding, not commanding. Just waiting, as though her answer genuinely mattered. I'm Myra, as she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I am not peculiar. I am simply not decorative. There is a difference, though my family has never learned it. Her mother made a small sound of horror. Her father's face reddened. But the vampire king smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve of the lips, but it transformed his face into something almost warm. No, he agreed. You are not decorative. You are something far more valuable. He turned back to Lord Hartwell, and the warmth disappeared from his expression like a candle being snuffed. I will take your daughter, Lord Hartwell. But not the one you offered. I will take Myra. The argument that followed was brief and entirely one-sided. Lord Hartwell protested that Myra was unsuitable, unmarriageable, that she had nothing to offer a king. Lady Hartwell added that she was strange, that she spent her nights reading by candlelight instead of sleeping, that she had opinions about things and sometimes voiced them aloud. Alara said nothing at all, but the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. Through it all, Myra stood very still and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not hope that her circumstances would improve, or that she would find happiness, but hope that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had been chosen for who she was rather than what she could provide. The king listened to Lord Hartwell's protests with the patience of someone who had heard such arguments many times before. Your opinion is noted, he said at last, ear and dismissed. The girl will come with me tonight. You will provide her with whatever belongings she wishes to bring. And the debt your family owes to my realm will be considered paid in full. But this is not a negotiation, Lord Hartwell. The king's voice did not rise, but something in it made the torches on the walls flicker. This is mercy. You should recognize it while it is still being offered. Lord Hartwell fell silent. Myra was given 1 hour to pack her belongings. It did not take her long. She had few possessions she valued, a handful of books her grandmother had left her, a pressed flower from the garden she had tended since childhood, letters from the servants she had written for her and who had written back to her after they were dismissed. She added practical clothing, sturdy boots, and a thick cloak that had belonged to her mother before her mother had decided that black was too morbid for a lady of the house. When she came back down to the great hall, the king was waiting for her alone. Her family had not come to say goodbye. She had not expected them to her, but it still hurt. Not the sharp pain of surprise, but the dull ache of confirmation. She had always known how little she mattered to them. Having it proven so clearly was simply the final line in a very long letter. "Are you ready?" the king asked. Myra looked around the hall one last time. The faded tapestries, the dusty chandeliers, the portrait of her grandfather who had been kind to her and had died too soon. Then she turned back to the king. "Yes," she said. "I have been ready for a long time." They walked together through the night. The king had no carriage, no horses, no retinue. He simply walked, and Myra walked beside him, and the darkness of the road seemed less frightening than it had any right to be. The moon was full overhead, casting silver light across the fields and forests, and the air smelled of autumn leaves and wood smoke. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the king said, without looking at her, "You may ask." "Ask what?" "Whatever questions are gathering in your mind. I can hear them like the rustling of birds in the branches. You are wondering why I chose you. Whether you are in danger. What will be expected of you?" Myra considered this. Are those the questions most people ask? They are the questions most people fear to ask. Then no, Myra said. Those are not my questions. The king glanced at her, and there was something like curiosity in his ancient eyes. Then what would you like to know? Myra thought for a moment. The road stretched out before them, and the night stretched out above them, and she felt, for the first time in years, like she had time. "What is your name?" she asked. "Your actual name, not your title." The king was silent for so long that she thought she had offended him. Then he said, very quietly, "Ellen. My name is Ellen." It has been a very long time since anyone asked. Ellen, as she repeated, and the name felt old and heavy on her tongue, like a word from a language almost forgotten. "Thank you for telling me." "You are not afraid of me," Ellen observed. "No." "Why not?" Myra watched the road ahead, the way it wound between ancient oaks whose branches made a cathedral ceiling above them. "Because you asked my name," she said. "You asked who I was, and you waited for me to answer. Monsters do not wait. They take. You have taken nothing from me that I was not eager to give." "And what have you given me?" "Conversation," Myra said. "And perhaps, eventually, honesty. If you prove to be worth it." Ellen made a sound that might have been a laugh, a rusty, unused thing, as though his sense of humor had been packed away for decades and only now brought out into the light. "I hope to prove worthy," he said. They reached the borders of the vampire realm as dawn approached. Myra had expected darkness, eternal night, shadows that moved with malevolent purpose, the trappings of the Gothic nightmares she had read about in her grandmother's old books. But the realm of the vampire king was not what the stories had promised. It was beautiful. The forests were old growth, ancient trees whose canopies filtered the light into something soft and golden. The paths were well maintained, bordered by wildflowers and berry bushes. And the people, because there were people living alongside the vampires, moved through the early morning with the easy rhythm of those who felt safe. "I don't understand," Amira said, as they passed a farmhouse where a mortal family was already starting their day, a vampire neighbor helping to repair their fence. "The stories say you're kind of monsters. That you prey on the living. That we are nothing but food to you." "The stories are wrong," Isoellen said simply. "Or rather, they are incomplete. There are vampires who have chosen cruelty, just as there are mortals who have done the same. But my realm is governed by older laws. We take only what is given freely. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. And we do not forget that we were all mortal once. Then why let the stories persist? Why let the world fear you?" Sorellen's expression grew thoughtful. "Because fear keeps the cruel at bay. Because there are those who would see us destroyed if they knew how gentle we have become. And because, sometimes, the darkness of our reputation is the only thing that keeps the truly dark from looking too closely at what we have built." They walked in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that Myra had only ever found in books. The castle was not a castle. It was a library. Or rather, it had been a castle once, long ago, but over the centuries it had been transformed into something else entirely. Towers had become reading rooms. Dungeons had become archives. The great hall, where kings had once held court, now held thousands upon thousands of books, scrolls, and manuscripts gathered from across the world. Myra stood in the doorway and felt her heart stop. "I preserve things," Isoellen said, watching her face. "Knowledge. Stories. History. It is, I think, the most important work there is. Books burn. Empires fall. But if someone takes the time to copy, to protect, to remember, then nothing is ever truly lost." "This is why you wanted me," Amira whispered. Not for anything else. For this." "I wanted you," Isoellen said gently, "because I saw a woman who had spent her life being overlooked and undervalued, and I recognized something of myself in her. I was not always a king, Myra. I was not always powerful. There was a time when I was the one no one saw, the one who did not fit, the one who was offered up by those who should have protected him." He moved past her into the library, his fingers trailing along the spines of books as though greeting old friends. "I could not save myself then," he continued. "But I can save others now. It is a poor substitute for justice, but it is something. And when I saw you standing in the shadows of your father's hall, watching your sister being offered like livestock, I knew that you deserved better than what that family could give you." Myra's eyes were burning, and she realized with distant surprise that she was close to tears. "You don't expect anything from me?" "I expect you to be yourself," Isoellen said. "To read, if you wish. To learn, if you are curious. To help me with the preservation work, if you find it meaningful. And to tell me, honestly, if you are ever unhappy here. I will not keep you against your will. That is not who I am." The tears came then, quiet and steady, and Myra did not try to stop them. No one had ever offered her so much by asking for so little. The months that followed were the happiest of Myra's life. She found her place in the library slowly, learning the systems of organization, the preservation techniques, the delicate work of restoring damaged manuscripts. The other inhabitants of the castle, vampires and mortals alike, welcomed her with a warmth she had never experienced. They were scholars and scribes, historians and healers, all of them drawn to this strange sanctuary by some need that the outside world could not meet. She learned that many of them had stories like hers. The servant girl who had been beaten by her master and fled into the forest, only to be found by Llewellyn's scouts and offered shelter. The elderly vampire who had been turned against his will and spent centuries seeking a place where he would not be forced to do harm. The orphaned children who had nowhere else to go and now had tutors, and warm beds, and a future. Llewellyn protected them all. Not through force, not through violence, but through the quiet persistence of sanctuary. His realm was a haven, a place where the lost and the overlooked could find purpose and peace. And Myra, who had spent her whole life feeling invisible, finally began to understand what it meant to be seen. A letter arrived from the Hartwell estate on a cold winter morning. Myra recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope and felt her stomach clench with old, familiar dread. But when she opened it, sitting alone in her favorite reading alcove, surrounded by books that had become her friends, she found not demands or complaints, but news. The estate had been sold. Her father's debts had finally consumed what little remained of the family fortune. Alara had married a merchant's son, not the noble match their parents had dreamed of, but apparently a kind man who made her laugh. Lady Hartwell had moved in with a distant cousin. Lord Hartwell had taken a position managing someone else's lands, his pride finally broken by circumstance. And at the bottom of the letter, in her mother's careful script, "We heard that you have found a place where you are valued. We did not believe it at first. Perhaps we should have valued you more when we had the chance. Perhaps it is too late to say that now. But I am glad, Myra. I'm glad you are no longer in our shadow." Myra read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it with the other letters she had kept, and went to find Llewellyn. He was in the restoration workshop, carefully reinforcing the binding of a manuscript that was older than he was. His hands moved with infinite patience, and he did not look up when she entered. "You received a letter from your family," he said. "Yes." "How did you know?" "Because you have been carrying a weight with you all morning, and now you seem lighter." Myra sat down across from him, watching his hands work. "They lost everything," she said. "The estate, a fortune, all of it. And my mother wrote to say she was glad I had found somewhere I was valued." Llewellyn's hands paused for just a moment. "Does that bring you satisfaction?" Myra considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last. "It brings me sadness. Not for myself, I have found more peace here than I ever knew was possible. But for them, for all the years they could have been happy if they had simply learned to see what was in front of them instead of what they wished was there. So Ellen set down his tools and looked at her directly. That, he said quietly, is the mark of a truly kind heart. To feel sorrow for those who hurt you, not because you have forgiven the hurt, but because you understand that cruelty is its own punishment. He reached across the table and took her hand, a gentle gesture, brief and warm. I am very glad, he said, that I chose you, Myra Hartwell. And I am very glad that you chose to stay. Years passed. Myra grew into her role as one of the library's senior preservationists, training new arrivals, traveling occasionally to acquire rare manuscripts, building a reputation of her own. She remained mortal, so Ellen had never offered to change her, and she had never asked. Some things, she decided, were meant to be finite. Some things were more precious because they would end. But the work she did would outlast her. The books she preserved would be read by generations she would never meet. The stories she helped save from oblivion would carry forward into a future she could not imagine. And that, she came to understand, was its own kind of immortality. On quiet evenings, she and So Ellen would sit together in the library, reading by lamplight, discussing philosophy and history and the strange patterns of mortal and immortal lives. They never became lovers. Their bond was something deeper than romance, something harder to name. They were partners in a shared purpose, friends in the truest sense, two souls who had found each other across an impossible distance and recognized something worth protecting. One evening, as autumn turned to winter and the first snow began to fall outside the library windows, Sir Ellen looked up from his book and said, Do you ever regret it? Leaving your family, coming here, living this strange half-lit life among books and vampires? Myra watched the snow fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white. No, she said. I regret nothing. I was invisible for 23 years, and then you looked at me, and I became real. That is not something I will ever regret. So Ellen smiled, a true smile, warm and unguarded. Good, he said. Because I do not regret choosing you. You have made this old library feel like home again. And that is a gift I can never repay. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the books stood silent and patient on their shelves, holding stories that spanned centuries. And Myra Hartwell, the Goth woman no one saw, turned the page of her own book and continued reading, surrounded by warmth and safety and the quiet knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be.